Hi, and welcome to the Capital Forum's 7th Annual Antitrust Thought Leaders Interview Series, sponsored by KL Discovery. My name is Nate Soderstrom with the Capital Forum. I'm here today with Joe Krauss of Hogan Lovells. Joe, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Nate. Pleasure to be here.
So, it has been about 18 months since Macon Delrahim came in as head of the Antitrust Division, about 12 months since Joe Simons came in as chairman of the FTC. So the new enforcers are in, the new front offices are in. From a merger enforcement perspective, what have you seen? Is it more continuity than change at the agencies with the new leadership? Any new developments you've seen, things that have changed? What have you seen kind of at a high level there?
I would say it's more continuity, as is typical with change of administrations in the antitrust world. I think the impact is not as extreme as some might expect. I think basic antitrust fundamental principles and economic policies are well entrenched. I think you start to see differences at the margins and possibly a different investigative approach from agencies to agencies, and I think that we might be seeing that in the new administration. I think there's been a push, as I think some suggested yesterday at the conference, that DOJ is invoking merger reforms to try to speed up the process. I'm all in favor of that. I hope that that actually happens. That has been promised before in the past to previous administrations, and its results may be positive in the short run, but in the long term, the problems come back. So I hope that they do come up with some fundamental changes to speed up the process for it. I think policy-wise, of course, we've seen initiatives on vertical mergers and comments on remedies, structural versus behavioral remedies. So I think all of those discussions are positive. Even though it's been 2 years in this administration overall, I think there is a certain amount of runway that each administration needs to start seeing results from these efforts, and I think we still are at the early stages of seeing the actual results of those steps.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think you alluded to this, but on vertical mergers, I think probably the headline of the last couple of years is the Antitrust Division's AT&T Time Warner challenge, certainly lost in district court and ultimately at the appeals level. Where do we stand on vertical merger enforcement, especially kind of in light of that situation? And what are you telling clients on this question? Is what you're telling clients on this question different than what you would have told them 18 or 24 months ago?
No, not really. I think sometimes a loss like the division suffered in AT&T Time Warner doesn't have a significant change in overall policy. I think most of these cases are very fact-specific, so I don't think that that's really going to have an impact, such as some might speculate, well, is the division going to step back on vertical? I don't think I've seen that. I've seen just as much scrutiny on vertical deals. Each case is very specific to its facts, so I think they'll continue that. Interestingly, at the same time as AT&T Time Warner, I was involved in the Northrop Grumman Orbital ATK transaction at the FTC, which was a vertical transaction, and the FTC accepted a consent including behavioral remedies. So, you know, at the same time that we heard speeches that behavioral remedies would not be accepted, especially in vertical cases, nevertheless, in those circumstances, the FTC found that a behavioral remedy was appropriate. So I think that shows that these are very driven by facts specific to each individual transaction. But overall, I don't see any stepping back, certainly on the vertical side, by either the FTC or the DOJ. I'm advising clients of the same level of scrutiny being applied. Recognizing that vertical mergers are difficult cases for the agencies to establish harm, and representing clients and articulating that with the division, I think, is the same approach that I've always taken
right.
with the agencies.
And you, I think you just alluded to this, but on this question of FTC versus DOJ on behavioral remedies, because Macon has been pretty explicit. We're simply not going to do behavioral. The FTC, you mentioned overlay TK, which obviously you're familiar with. Staples Ascendant also recently with the firewall as well.
Right.
So the FTC seems to be willing to do some level of behavioral remedies, especially on the firewall piece. Again, DOJ, we haven't seen it. I guess it doesn't mean they couldn't do a firewall, but given what Macon said, it seems tough. So it seems like there's a pretty, well, let me ask you this. How significant is the split between DOJ and FTC on the behavioral remedy question?
I think it's still yet to be seen because, as you said, outside of AT&T Time Warner, we've not seen an example that we can really point to of the division assessing a remedy in a vertical case that was a structural remedy. So I think we have to continue to wait and see if they do come forward with one to see if that line is really as stark. I think the difficulty always with vertical cases is, as I said, the difficulty in predicting harm and in a vertical context. And I think AT&T showed that. The two very good economists presented very different perspectives on the harm. I think in that case, either one of those could have been successful. They were both very compelling stories, but it shows how difficult it is to assess harm there. I think if we are seeing DOJ perhaps take a more cautious approach in those vertical cases, if the decision is to only take structural relief if there is a vertical harm, then I think they need to be very extra sure that there is really going to be harm from those vertical cases, and that's difficult to do in vertical cases, as we have seen.
That makes sense. One last question on the behavioral remedy piece. So, what Macon has been pretty explicit about, and I think he's alluded either explicitly or implicitly to Comcast, NBCU, is, look, we're not going to have these 100-page consent orders with non-discrimination provisions and quasi-price regulation arbitration. It's too regulatory. You do have this firewall remedy, which is, it's not structural, right? That's a behavioral remedy. But it seems like there's some idea that firewalls are easier to do and kind of divorced from this extremely regulatory quasi-price setting behavioral condition list. Do you think firewall, again, it's a behavioral remedy, is it fundamentally, I guess, easier to administer or less regulatory than some of the behavioral conditions that Macon is clearly taken off the table?
Yeah, for sure. I think firewall and I think some other types of behavioral remedies are more easy to enforce and to monitor. I think that's the main concern that I've read from Macon's speeches and his comments about behavioral remedies is the difficulty for the division to really monitor effectively to make sure that those provisions are abided by without becoming over-regulatory in a given market. And I understand that difficulty. When you look at consents that are 100 pages, you can see that's going to be difficult for division staff, as good as they are, to devote resources to a constant monitoring of an industry and parties to abide by that level of scrutiny. I guess I depart a little bit because I think that there are some circumstances like firewalls and other types of behavioral remedies which I think the division has shown an ability to monitor effectively. And again, I think in cases where you have horizontal harm, much easier to predict, vertical harm, much more difficult to predict, much less certain that will actually happen. I think there needs to be some balancing by the antitrust division and the FTC, kind of weighing the potential harm and the likelihood of that harm versus what type of remedy to impose. And I think that a balancing is that if the harm is low, if the risk of that harm happening is low, then I think it's would be unfair to impose a large structural remedy given that. And
Right.
I think that's the balancing that both agencies need to do, and they have done very well in the past in recognizing that. So I think behavioral remedies do have a place in antitrust enforcement in those types of cases. But if you have only structural, then I think it's unfair in some instances, or potentially will be overly enforcement-minded to impose a structural relief when the harm or the risk of that harm is relatively limited.
That makes sense. One last question on behavioral remedies. I realize I said my last question would be my last question. Aside from firewall provisions, what other kind of behavioral remedies do you look at as being relatively effective and easy to monitor?
Well, I think the anti-discrimination clauses, I think, in some industries, and the orbital ATK is a good example, where you have a discrete customer base,
Right.
where you can effectively monitor the behavior of the company. So I think an order such as that and a condition such as that, I think, can be easily monitored. I think there are other industries where that may be more difficult to monitor because of the nature of the sales, the nature of the customer base. So I think, again, it's very fact-specific to the particular industry and the particular products that we're dealing with. But
Yeah.
I think there are opportunities, and I think the agencies need to be open to consider those, maybe not accept them in all cases, but I think they need to be open to consider those, again, to kind of balance that order versus the harm that
Right.
they're anticipating may happen.
That makes sense. So I think the last topic we wanted to hit were structural remedies. There is a sense, and I think this is actually objectively verifiable, it appears that the agencies are taking a longer time to evaluate structural remedies. It seems like they're probably taking a more rigorous approach to evaluating structural remedies, buyers, assets, transition services, the whole package. Have you seen that in your practice? Has it accelerated under the new agency leadership? From a timing perspective, I should say decelerated. What are you seeing as far as timing and, I guess, rigor with which the agencies are evaluating these structural remedy proposals?
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I have seen increased scrutiny from staff and from management on proposed structural remedies, much more diligence from the agency's perspective on looking at all of the details of that structural remedy, including the buyers when you have an upfront buyer. So I have seen a lot of that, and I think, getting to the timing point that you mentioned earlier, I do think that it is contributing to a longer process as opposed to a shorter process that the new administration has come in hoping to establish, and I think that has worked against those efforts to try to speed up overall merger review.
Well, that's what you wonder,
so-
right? We can evaluate whether we think there's competitive harm within, say, the 6-month window that Make It has talked about. But if we find harm and we have to go out and do a structural remedy and find a buyer, that's not 1 or 2 more months. That's
Yeah,
4,
exactly,
5, 6.
Exactly. And I don't really, I think, again, depends upon the particular industry and the case, but I think that staff is very good, and I think they are very good at scrutinizing proposals, scrutinizing assets. They are very good and experienced at doing that. I would hope that the level of scrutiny that staff gives is not does not result in additive time once it gets up to management. And I think parties understand the work that needs to be done with staff to satisfy staff because they're doing their job, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And I think parties can accept that time element. But once it gets to a point where it goes beyond staff, there's an element of feeling that it's in a uncontrolled time review at that point. And there seems to be no deadlines, there seems to be we will get back to you when we get back to you.
Right.
And I don't think that that's what was intended, and I don't think that is intended. I think the front office needs to do their level of work in analyzing and being comfortable with the remedy. But I think there is more reliance upon staff that they could do to shorten that. Because staff does such a great job leading up to that point.
Right.
So we're seeing that time, and you mentioned the 6 months. I think we're seeing the time delay going beyond that 6 months more often than not.
So that's an interesting point. So what, not to put words in your mouth, but FTC, DOJ staff spending more time on these remedies and more rigor and more in-depth investigations. And FTC obviously bringing compliance. We're seeing not only that, but we're also seeing the front office and agency leadership. We're seeing remedies stay up at that level for maybe a longer period of time than we would have a few years ago. Is that kind of what you've observed?
That's what I've seen so far, and I think again we're early as much as we're in 2 years into the administration still in terms of getting new leadership in and their folks and their processes in place. I think we're still seeing at the early stages of that. But I do think, and I'm concerned about that we're seeing that added time at the end, which really should not be there.
Right,
I don't
right.
think should be there.
Yeah.
So I think both agencies need to concentrate on that and make sure that 6 months doesn't suddenly become 10 months or longer. Not to say that it has happened, Annie, but we want to caution and make sure that doesn't happen.
Right.
I hope that they're taking steps to make sure that doesn't happen.
And it's an interesting thing from the agency's perspective, because especially at the FTC, you think of everything they've caught as far as some of the perceived failed remedies or actual failed remedies.
Mm-hmm.
So I get why you would want to add more time into the process to make sure that you're not 51% sure this remedy is going to work, that you're 98. But in that same respect, 18-month merger reviews is probably not something that benefits everybody.
No. And companies just can't live under that uncertainty. That just adds cost, adds uncertainty, harms the business, harms the overall deal. So they really can't live with that. So I counsel clients that we should be very transparent with staff, what the timing is, try to work with staff on timing, have a constant dialogue and communication with staff throughout this entire process. Be realistic. If the agencies are going to require a remedy, be realistic and try to get to that conversation as quickly as possible with staff so that staff can do their due diligence and get that done within that 6-month period of time. Because any longer delay, and especially the uncertainty of when, that's the biggest difficulty for a lot of clients, a lot of companies, is not knowing. They're willing to live with 6 months or 9 months if they know that that's going to be it.
Right.
But
15
having
months
that
is tough.
uncertainty that it could drag longer is the difficult thing that they have.
That makes a lot of sense. Joe, I believe we have covered the entire universe of merger enforcement in 15 minutes. So with that, we'll wrap
15
up.
minutes.
I'm Nate Soders from Capital Forum. Again, Joe Krauss, Hogan Lovells. Joe, thanks again for being with us today.
Thank you. Pleasure.